Gideon Whitmore's hand came down so hard on the kitchen table that the coffee cups rattled off the edge and shattered on the floor. His face had gone the color of old ash. "Get him off my land." His voice wasn't loud. That was the worst part. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes before a man does something he can't take back. "Get that Blackwood filth off my land right now, Claire, or I swear I will drag him out myself." Claire stood between her father and the door to the back room where Lucas lay barely conscious, still burning with fever, still fighting to stay alive. She didn't move. And in that one moment, that single, trembling second, she had to decide what kind of woman she was going to be. If that were you standing in that doorway, would you have moved? If this story already has you holding your breath, you're exactly where we want you. Subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to its end. Because what happens next in that cabin will change everything you think you know about hatred, family, and what it really costs to tell the truth. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The storm had been building since mid-afternoon. Claire Whitmore had watched it come in from the northwest the way she always watched weather on the Montana frontier, with one eye on the sky and both hands already doing something useful. She'd been mending the east fence line since before noon, working her way along the posts her father had driven into that rocky soil back when she was still small enough to ride in front of him on the saddle. That felt like another lifetime now. She was 31 years old, she ran this ranch alone, and she didn't have the luxury of stopping work just because the clouds looked mean. The wind picked up around 4 o'clock. By 4:30, the temperature had dropped 15 degrees and the smell in the air had changed. That sharp electric smell that old-timers called God's warning, and Claire just called trouble. She packed her tools into the saddlebag, patted her horse Duchess on the neck, and told her they'd make it home before the worst of it hit. She was wrong. The rain came sideways and sudden, the way only Montana rain can, like the sky just gave up trying to hold it. Lightning cracked the ridge to the north, and Duchess spooked hard, nearly throwing Claire before she got her settled. They pushed through the last quarter mile with their heads down, the rain so heavy Claire could barely see her own hands on the reins, and she was already mentally cataloging what needed to be checked on the property. The chicken coop roof that she'd been meaning to repair for 2 weeks, the gap in the south pasture fence, She almost rode right past him. It was Duchess who stopped first, just planted all 4 feet and refused to go another step, which was the only reason Claire looked down instead of straight ahead. And there, crumpled against the base of a downed fence post like a pile of wet laundry, was a man. Her first thought was that he was dead. Her second thought was that she needed to get back on her horse and ride for help. Her third thought, the one that actually made her dismount and kneel in the mud beside a complete stranger in the middle of a lightning storm, was that she'd seen enough dead things in her life to know the difference, and this man's chest was still moving, barely, but moving. It was big, she noticed that first. Long through the leg, broad through the shoulder, the kind of build that came from actual work rather than showing off. His hat was gone. His face was half buried in the mud, and she had to turn him carefully, bracing herself for what she might find, because a man thrown from a horse in a storm could look like almost anything underneath. What she found was a face that was younger than she'd expected, maybe 35, give or take, with dark hair plastered flat and a gash above his left eyebrow that had bled considerably before the rain washed most of it away. His skin was already hot under her fingers, not the good kind of hot that meant life, the bad kind, the kind that meant his body was already fighting something it might not win. "Hey!" She put her hand against his jaw. "Hey, can you hear me?" Nothing. She looked around. There was no horse anywhere she could see, no hat, no gear, nothing but the man in the mud, and the broken fence post beside him and the storm coming down on all of it without apology. She looked back at him, at the soaked canvas of his coat, at his hands. She always looked at a man's hands because hands told you more than faces did, and saw the calluses, the dirt worked so deep into the cracks that no amount of washing would ever fully get it out. A working man. A rancher's hands. Her eyes moved to his saddle, which was half buried in the mud a few feet away. It must have come loose in whatever fall had put him here. She reached for it without thinking, dragging it clear of the mud so she could get a look at it, because a man's saddle was his signature out here. It told you where he came from, who his people were, whether he was the kind of man who maintained his gear or let it go to ruin. The leather was quality, well-oiled, cared for, and burned into the fender, plain and deep and unmistakable, even through the mud, was a brand she hadn't seen in 20 years but would have recognized in the dark. A double B in a circle. Blackwood. Claire's hand went still on the leather. The rain kept coming. The man in the mud kept breathing in that shallow, worrying way. And Claire Whitmore knelt there in the storm with her hand on a Blackwood saddle and felt 20 years of her father's grief pressing down on her like a physical weight. She should go. She knew she should go. She sat there for what felt like a very long time. Probably it was 30 seconds. Then she said, out loud, to no one in particular, "Oh, for the love of—" and started the hard, graceless work of getting an unconscious 200-pound man across the back of a reluctant horse. It took her the better part of 20 minutes. Duchess was not cooperative. The man was dead weight in every sense of the phrase, and at one point Claire lost her grip, and he nearly went back into the mud entirely, and she said several things that her father would not have approved of. By the time she had him secured well enough to walk Duchess back toward the ranch, her back was screaming, her hands were bleeding from where the fence wire had caught her earlier, and the storm was showing no signs of letting up. The whole walk back, she kept her eyes on the man draped across the saddle and her mind firmly blank. If she thought too hard about what she was doing, bringing a Blackwood onto Whitmore land, she would think herself out of it. So she didn't think. She just walked. The isolated cabin sat at the edge of the north pasture, about a quarter-mile from the main house. Claire's father had built it 20 years ago for a ranch hand who'd never arrived, and it had sat empty ever since, used for storage and little else. It had a good stove, a sound roof, and nobody could see it from the road. Those three things made it the right choice, and she didn't examine any of the other reasons she might have chosen it over bringing him to the main house. Getting him off the horse and onto the cot was worse than getting him on the horse had been. He roused slightly at one point, enough to grab her arm with a grip that startled her with its strength, and said something she couldn't make out. "Easy," she told him. "Easy. You're out of the rain." His grip loosened. His eyes didn't open. She built the fire first because heat mattered more than anything else right now. Then she dealt with the head wound, which was ugly but not as bad as it had looked in the mud. Head wounds always bled dramatically, her father used to say, which was nature's way of making you pay attention. She cleaned it with the whiskey she kept in the cabin's supply box and didn't let herself think about whether he deserved the whiskey. He needed it. That was enough. The fever was the real problem. She'd seen fever like this before and she knew how it went. It would climb before it broke. It would do things to a man's mind before his body came back around. She needed to keep the temperature from going any higher. She needed to keep water in him, and she needed to do both things through the night. She didn't have any of the remedies she kept in the main house. What she had was what was in the supply box. A few strips of cloth, a bottle of whiskey, some dried herbs she barely remembered putting there, and her own hands. She worked with what she had. He talked through the fever. Not sense, just fragments, the way people do when their mind is trying to process more than their body can handle. He said a name she didn't catch. He said something about horses, something about a valley, something that might have been an apology or might have been an argument. She couldn't tell. Once he tried to sit up, and she had to hold him down, putting her weight into it, saying, "Stop, stay still, I mean it," until he settled. Around midnight, his temperature peaked. She was sure of it because his skin was hot enough that she could feel it through the cloth she was using to cool him, and he'd stopped talking, which was somehow more frightening than the talking had been. She sat beside the cot with her hand on his wrist, counting his pulse, telling herself she was doing this because a man was a man, and you didn't let a man die in your cabin if you could help it, and the name on his saddle didn't change that fact. She mostly believed herself. Around 2 in the morning, the fever shifted. She felt it before she saw it. A change in the quality of the heat coming off him, something loosening. He took a deeper breath. Another. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Don't you dare die on me," she told him quietly. Not after all that. He didn't die. He slept. She sat with her back against the wall beside the cot and watched the fire and let herself be exhausted for a little while. Outside, the storm was finally spending itself. The rain was softer now, just rain instead of assault, and the lightning had moved off to the east. She could hear the horses in the paddock moving around, settling. She must have slept some, because the next thing she was aware of was gray morning light coming through the cabin's one window, and the man on the cot looking at her. He was conscious. Not fully. His eyes were glassy and his color was still wrong. But he was looking at her with the particular expression of a man trying to figure out where he was and how he got there. "Morning," she said. His voice, when it came, was rough from the fever. "Where? Montana. My property. You were by my fence line when the storm hit." She paused. "Your horse is gone. Do you remember what happened?" He thought about it. She could see him working through it, sorting through the fever-scrambled hours. "Lightning hit the ridge, through me." A pause. "Landed hard." "You landed on a fence post, which is worse. You've got a gash on your head and a fever that tried to kill you last night." She stood up because sitting felt too vulnerable. "I'm Claire Whitmore. This is my land." Something moved in his face when she said her name. She watched it happen. A flicker of something she couldn't immediately name. Recognition, maybe. Or something more complicated than that. "Lucas," he said. Then, with the slight hesitation of a man who's learned that his last name sometimes changes the weather. "Lucas Blackwood." Claire didn't move. She held his gaze and kept her face carefully still, and did not look toward the door where his saddle was leaning against the wall, the brand facing inward because she'd turned it that way without entirely deciding to. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, "you're welcome to stay until you can ride." He studied her for a long moment. There was something in his eyes that she wasn't expecting. Not suspicion, not the defensive readiness she might have anticipated from a man who'd just woken up in a stranger's cabin. It was closer to weariness, the bone-deep kind that had nothing to do with the fall. "You know who I am," he said. It wasn't a question. "I know your name," she said carefully. "That's not the same thing." "No," she agreed. "It's not." He looked at the ceiling. His jaw was tight. "You should have left me." "Probably," she said. "You need water. I'll get it." She went to get water, and while her back was to him, she allowed herself exactly 3 seconds to feel the full weight of what she'd done and what it might mean. 3 seconds, and then she put it away. The way she'd learned to put things away when she was 12 years old, and her father had come home from the Blackwood property with his hands shaking and his eyes hollow, and something broken in him that had never fully healed. Put it away. Deal with what's in front of you. She turned around with the water and found Lucas Blackwood watching her with those tired eyes, and she handed him the cup and didn't let their fingers touch, and neither of them said anything else for a while. He slept again after that, which was what he needed. Claire used the time to check on the main house, assess the storm damage. A section of the chicken coop roof had gone just like she'd feared, and 3 fence sections were down in the south pasture. And think about what she was going to tell anyone who asked why she was spending time in the north cabin. She decided she wouldn't mention it until she had to. It was the kind of decision that made a certain pragmatic sense in the moment, and the kind of decision that has a way of growing complications the longer it sits. Over the next 2 days, Lucas's fever came and went in waves. The bad night was behind him, but the aftermath clung, the way serious illness does. The exhaustion that went deeper than sleep could fix, the confusion that crept in at the edges. He was not a good patient. Claire discovered this on the second evening when she arrived with food to find him sitting up and trying to pull his boots on. "What are you doing?" she said. "I need to send word to my ranch." His hands weren't steady. The boot wasn't cooperating. "My men will think—" "Your men will think you got caught in the storm," she said, which is exactly what happened. "You can't ride. You can barely sit up." "I can ride." "You passed out trying to put on a boot." He opened his mouth, closed it, put the boot down with the careful dignity of a man choosing not to argue a point he'd already lost. "I'll send word myself," she said. "I'll tell them you're sheltering on a neighboring property, and you'll be back when you can ride without killing yourself. Will that do?" He looked at her for a moment with that same measuring expression she'd noticed the first morning. "Why are you doing this?" She thought about that. The honest answer was complicated, and she didn't fully understand it herself. The simple answer was easier. "Because you needed help," she said, "and because the alternative was leaving a man to die by my fence, and I'd have to look at that fence every day for the rest of my life." Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile. He didn't look like a man who smiled easily, but something that softened the lines around his eyes for just a moment. "That's a practical reason," he said. "I'm a practical woman. The Whitmores always were, from what I heard." She went very still. He caught it. "Sorry, I didn't mean—" "What did you hear?" She kept her voice level. She was good at keeping her voice level, years of practice. "Just that your family has run a serious operation up here for a long time." He was watching her carefully now. "My father talked about your father sometimes. Not, it wasn't unkind things. More like, respect, maybe. It was a long time ago." He paused. "Before things went the way they went." The fire crackled. Outside, a horse moved in the paddock. "Yes," Claire said. "Before that." She left shortly after, and the whole walk back to the main house she could feel the shape of the conversation they hadn't quite had. The subject with walls around it. The 20-year silence sitting between their families like a body neither of them wanted to be the first to move. She'd been carrying her father's grief long enough that it had started to feel like her own. Some days she couldn't tell the difference anymore. On the third morning, Lucas's fever finally broke completely. She knew it the moment she walked through the cabin door. The quality of the air was different, and he was sitting at the small table near the window with his hands wrapped around a cup of water, looking out at the pasture with clear eyes. He turned when she came in, and she thought for the first time that she was actually seeing him. Not the fever, not the injury, not the brand burned into his saddle. Just the man. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to tell me the truth." She set down the food she'd brought. "All right. You knew who I was the first morning, before you told me your name." He looked at her steadily. "Your face did something when I said Blackwood." He wasn't wrong. She'd been hoping he'd been too far gone to notice. "I recognized the name," she said, "because of your father." "Yes." He nodded slowly, looking back out the window. The morning light was coming in sharp and clean after the storm, the kind of light that made everything look more honest than it wanted to be. "What do you know about it?" he asked. "About what happened between our families?" "What do you know about it?" she said. I was quiet for a long moment. "Not enough," he said finally. "That's what I came back to find out." And something in the way he said it, the weight of it, the plainness of it, the absence of any defensiveness or hostility, made Claire Whitmore pull out the other chair and sit down across from him, which was not something she had planned to do. "You came back to the ranch to look into the past?" she asked. "I've been gone 12 years, breeding horses in Wyoming." He wrapped both hands around his cup. "My father is getting old. I came back because family is family, even when it's complicated. But there are things about this valley, about what happened here, that nobody ever explained to me straight. My father doesn't talk about it. The men who work for us skirt around it." He paused. "I found some letters. In the main house. In a box that had been stored for years. Letters between my father and a lot of people." He stopped. "What kind of letters?" she asked carefully. "The kind that make you realize you don't know your family as well as you thought you did." The fire had burned down to coals. Neither of them moved to build it back up. "I haven't told my father I'm looking," he said. "I don't know how to have that conversation yet." She understood that. She understood it more than she wanted to say. "My father," she said after a long pause, "has not been the same since the fire. 20 years is a long time to carry something like that." "No," Lucas said quietly. "It isn't long enough." She looked at him. He was looking at his hands. "I'm sorry," he said, "about your mother." 3 words, quietly spoken. From a man she'd known for 4 days, who'd spent most of those days unconscious, who bore the name her father had taught her to associate with everything that had gone wrong. She was not prepared for how much those 3 words hit her. She'd had condolences before, at the funeral, in the years after, from neighbors and strangers and her father's few friends. But there was something different about hearing it from him, something that she couldn't entirely explain. "Thank you," she said. She said it to the table. They sat with that for a while. Outside, the wind was quiet. The pasture stretched out in morning light that didn't ask any questions. Claire didn't know what any of this was going to become. She didn't know what he'd find in those letters, or what she was going to do when her father came home. She didn't know how a thing that started with a man unconscious in the mud beside her fence was going to end. What she knew was that she'd made a choice in the storm, in the dark, with her hand on a saddle brand that should have sent her riding the other way. And that choice had led here, to this table, to this morning, to a conversation that felt like the first honest one she'd had in longer than she could easily remember. She didn't know what to do with that yet. But she didn't leave either. The morning after Lucas's fever finally broke, Claire found him standing outside the cabin in the cold before dawn, leaning against the fence rail with a cup of coffee he'd made himself, watching the dark edge of the mountains turn pale. She'd come out early because she always came out early. There was no such thing as sleeping in when you ran a cattle operation alone, and she'd been halfway to the cabin before she realized she was already thinking about how he'd slept, whether the fever had come back in the night, whether she'd need to ride for the doctor in town after all. She stopped when she saw him standing there and told herself that the small loosening in her chest was relief, strictly practical, the relief of not having a dead man to explain. "You're up," she said. "Couldn't sleep." He didn't look at her. He was watching the mountains. "I keep thinking about my horse." "What was his name?" A pause. "Ranger. Gray Roan, 6 years old." Another pause. "I raised him from a foal." She didn't say anything to that because there wasn't anything to say that would help. A man's horse was his horse. You didn't put words around that kind of loss. "He might have found shelter," she said after a moment. "Sometimes they do." "Maybe." They stood there in the cold together, not quite comfortable, not quite uncomfortable. The mountains were turning from black to gray to the particular pale gold that meant the sun was coming up behind them even if you couldn't see it yet. Somewhere in the north pasture, one of Claire's horses made a low sound and another answered. "I need to ride back to my property today," Lucas said. "I've stayed too long already." "Your ribs are still—" "I know what my ribs are doing," he said, not unkindly. "They'll complain the whole way. I can manage that." He finally turned and looked at her. In the early light, his face was still hollowed from the fever, the gash above his eyebrow healing to a dark line. "I want you to know that I understand what you did, bringing me here. And I don't intend to make it complicated for you." She raised an eyebrow. "How would you make it complicated?" "By talking about it. In town. To people." He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "This valley has a long memory and longer tongues. I know that a Whitmore sheltering a Blackwood is the kind of thing that turns into a story, and not the good kind." She studied him. "And you're telling me you won't talk?" "I'm telling you I won't talk." She believed him. She wasn't entirely sure why she believed him, because she'd known him less than a week, and he'd spent most of that unconscious, but something in the way he said it, flat and plain, no performance in it, landed as true. "All right," she said. "Thank you." He nodded once and went back to looking at the mountains. "The south fence is down in 3 sections," she said after a moment. "From the storm. I haven't had time to get to it because I've been up here." "I noticed." He glanced sideways at her. "I could fix it before I go." "You can't fix fence with broken ribs. Watch me." She opened her mouth, closed it. The thing about a man with that particular set to his jaw was that arguing took more energy than just letting him try. "Fine, but if you pop something loose and start bleeding internally, I'm not doing this again." Something that might have been a smile crossed his face. It was brief, and it was a little crooked, and it made him look younger than the weariness in his eyes suggested. "Deal," he said. He fixed 2 sections of fence that morning, working slowly and carefully in the way a man does when he's managing pain he refuses to acknowledge out loud. Claire worked beside him on the 3rd section, and they didn't talk much, just the practical exchange of "pass me that," "hold this end," the way people talk when they're doing physical work together that requires coordination. She found it comfortable in a way she hadn't expected. She was used to working alone. She'd gotten so used to it that other people on her land sometimes felt like interference. Lucas didn't feel like interference. He just felt like another pair of hands that knew what they were doing. By noon, he was white around the mouth from the effort. She didn't comment on it. She went to the house and came back with food, and they ate sitting on the fence rail. And at some point during the meal, he said, "The south pasture slope's wrong." And she said, "I know." And he said, "You're losing water drainage." And she said, "I know that too." And he thought about it for a minute and then said, "My grandfather rerouted a hillside pasture in Wyoming. I could show you what he did if you wanted." She looked at him. "You'd be doing me a favor and not fixing your own property." "My property can wait a day." A pause. "I also have a crew. You're alone here." She wasn't sure if that was pity or just observation. The way he said it, straightforward, not gentle, made her decide it was observation. One day, she said, he stayed 3 days. Stayed, not because she asked him to. He stayed because there kept being another thing, a livestock trail that was blocked by storm debris, a section of the water trough system that had cracked in the freeze that followed the storm, a problem with how the hay storage was arranged that was going to cause rotting by November. He spotted things the way a man spots things when he's been raising animals his whole life and can't turn that part of his brain off. And each time he said, "This one's going to cost you later," she said, "I know." And he said, "I can fix it before I go." And she said some version of fine, and he fixed it. On the second evening, she cooked proper food in the main house and told him to come eat at a table instead of in the cabin. It felt like a line crossed, and she knew it felt like that. And she crossed it anyway because she was tired of carrying food out through the cold, and also because the cabin didn't have a real table, and she was tired of watching him eat hunched over his knees. He sat at the kitchen table with his hat on his knee and ate her cooking with the manners of a man who'd been raised right and didn't compliment the food too much, which she appreciated. She hated when men over-complimented her cooking as though they were surprised a woman who spent all day in the mud could also boil water. "Tell me about Wyoming," she said. He glanced up. "What do you want to know?" 12 years is a long time to stay away from your family's land. It is. He pushed the food around his plate for a moment. I left when I was 23. My father and I didn't. We had different ideas about how things should be run, about a lot of things. He was quiet for a moment. I needed distance to figure out what I actually thought, separate from what I'd been told to think. And what did you figure out? That my father isn't a bad man, he said carefully, and that being not a bad man doesn't mean you've done everything right. She thought about her own father when he said that. About Gideon Whitmore, who was currently in Billings visiting her uncle and would be back before the month was out, and who was not a bad man, and who had also done some things that weren't right, and who had been carrying grief for 20 years that had curdled slowly into something harder and more permanent than grief. That's a complicated thing to know about someone you love, she said. Yes, he said. It is. They talked after dinner the way people talk when the awkwardness has mostly worn off, and what's left is just the fact of each other, carefully at first, and then less carefully. He told her about horse breeding, about how he'd built his operation in Wyoming from 3 mares and a stallion his grandfather had left him into something real, something that provided for the people who worked for him. There was quiet pride in how he talked about it, not the loud kind, the kind that needs witnesses. Just the satisfaction of a man who'd built something with his own hands and knew what it cost. She told him about running the ranch alone, about how her father had started leaving for longer stretches 2 years ago. To visit her uncle, he said, though she suspected some of it was that the land held too much of her mother in it, and some days that was more than he could stand. She told him about the orchard she'd been thinking about, the old apple trees on the far side of the East Ridge that had been neglected for so long they'd gone half wild, and her idea of clearing and restoring them, maybe expanding, maybe eventually selling to some of the orchards that were setting up beyond the county line. You'd have to get the soil tested, he said. I know. And clear the root competition. Some of those wild growth trees around here, they'll strangle an orchard if you let them. I know that too. You know a lot, he said. I've had time to think about it, she said. Not always time to do it. He looked at her across the table. One person can only do so much. You don't have to say that like it's a limitation, she said, slightly sharper than she intended. Plenty of people run operations alone. I didn't say it was a limitation, he said, and there was that quality again. Just flat and plain, no shape put on it. I said one person can only do so much. That's just a fact of the world. Doesn't mean the person isn't doing enough. She looked back at him. He held her gaze and didn't flinch from it, and didn't try to soften what he'd said. Sorry, she said. You don't have to apologize for it. I was going to say I get defensive. I know, he said. It's all right. She wasn't sure when she'd last had someone tell her something she'd done was all right without the word carrying some kind of weight or judgment. It sat strangely. She turned back to her food and finished eating and told herself it was just easier to accept kindness from someone who didn't know you well enough to use it against you later. On the third morning, he told her he was going back to the Blackwood ranch. His ribs had settled to a manageable ache, the work was caught up, and he had a crew that needed direction. He set it at the door of the main house with his hat in his hands, standing the same way he'd stood the first morning when he was a stranger with fever, except that he wasn't a stranger anymore, and she wasn't sure exactly when that had happened. "You can take one of my horses," she said, "until you find Ranger, or until your men can bring you one." He shook his head. "I'll walk to the Hennessy place. They'll lend me a horse." "The Hennessy place is 4 miles. I've had worse mornings." She looked at him. He looked back. She thought about saying something else and decided against it. "Thank you," she said, "for the fence, and the rest of it." "Thank you," he said, "for not leaving me in the mud." She almost smiled. She caught it before it fully formed and turned it into something neutral, which she immediately thought was a ridiculous thing to do and couldn't entirely explain why she'd done it. He put his hat on, nodded once, and walked down the porch steps and away through the pasture toward the Hennessy Road. She watched him until the tree line swallowed him up and then went inside and sat at the kitchen table with her coffee and told herself that was that. It wasn't that. He came back 11 days later. He came back on a solid black horse that wasn't Ranger. She noticed that immediately, noticed the set of his shoulders when he dismounted, the way he didn't look at the horse the way a man looks at his own horse. And he came to the front of the property this time, to the main gate, which felt deliberate. "I found the problem with your orchard idea," he said, by way of greeting. She stood on the porch with a hammer in her hand because she'd been fixing the porch rail. "You've been thinking about my orchard?" "I talked to a man in town who knows the soil up here. The East Ridge has limestone underneath the topsoil. That's actually good for apples. Better than good." He pulled a folded paper from his coat. He drew me a rough map of where the layer runs. "If you clear the north section of that wild growth first, you've got about 3 acres of prime ground." She came down the porch steps and took the paper. It was a rough hand-drawn map with measurements noted along the edges in handwriting that wasn't Lucas's. Neater, more cramped. "You had someone draw this," she said. "Henderson at the feed store. He grew up on apple land in Oregon, knows more about soil than most people know about anything." A pause. "He didn't charge me anything. We talked about horses. He has a daughter who wants one." She looked at the map for a long moment. Then she looked at him. "Why did you do this?" He thought about it with that careful quality she'd come to recognize. The way he didn't just say the first thing that came, the way he actually considered his words before he used them. "Because you talked about it like something that mattered," he said. "Not like a plan, like something you'd been holding on to." She folded the map again and held it. "Thank you," she said. Then, "Do you want to see the actual orchard?" He looked at her. "I thought you'd never ask." They rode out to the East Ridge that afternoon through the patchy timber that still held the damage from the storm. Limbs down, soil disturbed, one old pine split clean in half by lightning, still smelling faintly of it. He didn't talk much while they rode, neither did she, but it wasn't the silence of two people who didn't know what to say to each other. It was the other kind. The orchard, when they reached it, was a state. 30-odd years of neglect had done what neglect does. The rows her grandfather had planted were barely visible under the wild growth that had pushed in from the edges, and the trees themselves were scraggly and over-tall and fighting for light in ways that had made them misshapen. But they were alive. That was the thing that always caught her when she came up here. Every one of them, still alive. Lucas dismounted and walked between the trees without being invited to. He put his hand on the bark of the nearest one, an old gesture, the way farmers touch their land, and looked up into the crown. "How old are these?" he asked. "Oldest ones are probably 40 years. My grandfather planted the first section." He knew what he was doing. He moved to another tree, then another. She watched him work through the orchard the way she'd watched him work fence, methodical, unhurried, paying attention to things she'd stopped seeing because she'd been looking at them so long. "These 3 at the north end," he said, stopping. "They're a different variety from the rest. See the leaf shape?" She came to stand beside him and looked. He was right. She'd never noticed. "He must have added them later," she said. "Different season." "My grandfather did the same thing. Mixed varieties on purpose, so the bloom times overlap and you get better pollination." He tilted his head. "Whoever planted these knew what they wanted." She looked at the trees her grandfather had planted and felt something move in her chest that she didn't have a clean name for. Not sadness, exactly. Something quieter and more complicated than sadness. I want to get it back, she said. Not exactly what it was. Better. You could, he said simply. It would take 2 seasons of hard work to clear and reshape, but the bones are here. 2 seasons is a long time. Things usually are. She looked sideways at him. He was still looking at the trees. You said you'd been looking into your family's history, she said. The words came out more carefully than she'd intended. The letters you mentioned. He was quiet for a moment. I found more since I got back. More letters? Letters. Old ledgers. Some things I don't fully understand yet. He put his hands in his pockets and looked up at the sky through the apple's trees. I know something happened between our families. I know it involved a fire. I know my father has never once talked about it in my presence, which means, whatever it is, it lives inside him in a way that's still got its teeth in him. A pause. I need to understand it before I can decide what to do with it. She was very careful now. She could feel herself being careful, the way you feel yourself not stepping on ice you can see through. What are you hoping to find? He turned and looked at her directly. The truth? Whatever that turns out to be. He held her gaze. I'm not going in with an idea of what I want it to say. I just want it to be true. She thought about her father, about the way Gideon Whitmore's hands had shaken that night 20 years ago when he'd come home from the Blackwood property, ash-stained and wild-eyed and carrying the news that would change everything. About how she'd been 12 years old and her mother had been 2 hours dead, and her father had said the Blackwoods in a voice like a door slamming on something. That's a harder thing to want than it sounds, she said. I know it is. She turned away and walked between the trees, and he let her go without following, and she stood at the far end of the orchard where the wild growth pressed hardest and looked at the mountains beyond the ridge and tried to figure out what she was doing. What she'd been doing for the past 3 weeks, really, since the moment she'd knelt in the mud beside a Blackwood saddle and made a choice. She could tell him. She could turn around right now and tell him what she knew, or what she thought she knew, which was only ever what her father had told her, which was the story as her father had carried it. The Blackwood name, the fire, her mother running in, not coming out. That was the story. That was what 20 years of grief and silence had calcified around. But she didn't know if it was the whole story, and she didn't know what telling him now, before he'd found what he was looking for, before she'd had a chance to understand what she was doing, would cost either of them. She walked back to where he was standing and said, I think we should start clearing from the north end, like you said. He looked at her for a moment. She thought he might push, might say we were talking about something else, but he didn't. He just nodded, and they walked the north section together, and he showed her where to start, and she showed him where the worst of the route competition was. And by the time they rode back down to the main property, the sun was low and golden, and the day had used itself up entirely. At the gate, she said, Come back Thursday if you want. I'll start the clearing, and you can tell me what I'm doing wrong. He raised an eyebrow. What makes you think you'll do it wrong? I always start wrong, she said. Then I figure it out. He held her gaze for a beat. All right, he said. Thursday. He came Thursday, and the Thursday after that. And then it stopped being Thursday specifically and became just when there was work to be done, and there was always work to be done. And increasingly, some of that work stretched across both their properties in ways that made good practical sense, and also in ways that didn't need to be examined too closely. He found Ranger 3 weeks after the storm. One of his men had spotted the gray roan sheltering in a draw on the eastern boundary of the Blackwood property, thin and spooked but sound in all 4 legs. Lucas came to tell her personally, which she thought was interesting. He could have sent word. It wasn't news that required a visit. And the relief in his face when he talked about the horse was so unguarded that she looked away from it the way you look away from something too direct. He's all right? She asked. He's better than all right. My man said he'd found a hollow with good grass, been living there like a king. Something loosened in Lucas's face that she hadn't seen loose before. He came right to the halter when they approached, didn't even fight. He trusts people, she said. He trusts me, Lucas said, which he probably shouldn't, given what I put him through. You didn't put him through the storm. I was riding him in it. Because you had to get home. Because I made a judgment call that went wrong. He was quiet for a moment. That's just something I have to sit with. She looked at him. You sit with a lot of things. Doesn't everyone? She thought about her father. About 20 years of sitting with something that had never been fully understood, never been resolved. About the particular way that unanswered grief hardens over time. Not softer, never softer, just more solid. A stone where there should have been water. Some people sit with things too long, she said. He looked at her steadily. Are we still talking about my horse? She picked up the fence tool she'd been using and went back to work. I need to finish this section before it gets dark. He watched her for a moment, and then he picked up the other end of the wire and helped her finish the section without saying another word. And that was fine. And she told herself it was fine. The afternoon her father's letter arrived saying he was coming home at the end of the month, Claire sat at the kitchen table for a long time, looking at the handwriting on the envelope before she opened it. She knew what the letter would say, the dates, the practical arrangements, maybe a request for her to have the horses ready because he'd want to ride out the morning. He got back, the way he always wanted to ride out the morning he got back, as though the land needed checking even when she'd been checking it the whole time he was gone. She opened it. It said exactly what she'd expected. She folded it and sat with it for a minute, and then she got up and went outside because sitting inside with it felt wrong. The last frost of the season had come and gone, and the ground was soft and the orchard had been half cleared. She and Lucas had worked through it steadily over the past weeks, and the north section was already showing what it wanted to be. 3 good rows of old trees standing properly in the light for the first time in years. The wild growth cut back and the root competition managed. She'd ordered new rootstock from a supplier down south, and it was coming before the end of April, and she had a plan for where it would go and how the rows would run. And it was the first time in longer than she could remember that she'd had a plan for something that wasn't just maintenance, wasn't just keeping what already existed from falling apart, but actually growing something new. She stood at the edge of the cleared section and let herself have the feeling for a moment. It wasn't simple. It had Lucas in it, and Lucas had the Blackwood name in it, and the Blackwood name had her father in it, and her father was coming home in 3 weeks. And when he came home, he was going to see the repairs, and the cleared orchard, and the changed fences, and he was going to ask who she'd had working on the property, and she was going to have to say something. She hadn't decided what she was going to say. That wasn't strictly true. She knew what the honest answer was. She just hadn't decided if she was ready for what the honest answer would cost. The next time Lucas came by, she met him at the gate instead of the house, which was different from how it had been going, and he noticed, she could tell he noticed, though he didn't say anything, just waited. My father is coming home at the end of the month, she said. Something moved in his face and stilled. I see. He doesn't know you've been here. No. A pause. Does he need to? She looked at him. He's going to see the work, the orchard, all of it. He'll ask. Lucas nodded slowly. And what will you tell him? I don't know yet. She said it plainly. I want to be honest with him. I've always been honest with him. But I also know what he's going to say when he hears your name, and I know it's going to be... She stopped. Bad, Lucas said. Yes. He was quiet for a long moment. A horse in the paddock moved and another answered. The mountains were sharp and clear in the afternoon light, the kind of clarity that Montana gets in late spring when the air has finally lost its winter weight. He blames my family for the fire, Lucas said. It wasn't a question. She looked at him directly. Yes, he does. And he's not... I understand why. He turned and looked away toward the tree line. Something happened. Whatever it wasn't nothing. I know that much from the letters. His jaw was tight. I just don't know what the true shape of it is yet, and I can't... He stopped. Started again. I can't ask my father anything when I haven't figured out what questions to ask. What have the letters told you so far? She asked. He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said that my father was there, at the fire, that he's been carrying something about it for a very long time. He paused, and that he never told anyone what he was carrying. The words landed between them, and neither of them moved. Lucas, she started. I know, he said. Quietly, with that weight she'd come to recognize as the way he handled things he couldn't fix yet. I know there's something I don't know. I'm going to find out what it is. He turned back and looked at her. I'm asking you to give me a little more time before your father comes home. Not to hide anything, just to find out what I'm dealing with before everything explodes. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about all the things she knew and hadn't said. She thought about her father and the way his hands had shaken. She thought about the trees in the orchard standing finally in the light. 3 weeks, she said. Something in his eyes shifted, relief and something more serious than relief. Thank you. Don't thank me, she said. Whatever's in those letters, whatever your father has been carrying, it's going to come out. And when it does, the two of us being, whatever we are, isn't going to make your father's truth easier for mine to hear. You understand that? Yes, he said. I know that. So we're not buying peace, she said. We're buying time to understand something before it explodes. That's all I'm asking. She nodded once. 3 weeks. He looked at her with something in his face that she couldn't fully decode, something that was too careful and too honest at the same time, and he said, for what it's worth, coming back here, finding out about this valley, about what happened. I thought it was going to be the worst thing about coming home. And? She said. He looked at the orchard behind her, at the cleared rows and the old trees standing in proper light. Then he looked back at her. And some of it has been the best thing instead, he said. She didn't let herself answer that, not in words anyway. But she didn't look away from it either, and she thought that was probably honest enough for now. 3 weeks. She had 3 weeks before Gideon Whitmore came home, and the valley's long memory woke back up, and everything that had been quietly, carefully, imperfectly built between two people on broken ground was going to get tested in ways neither of them could fully predict. She turned and walked back toward the orchard, and Lucas fell into step beside her without being asked, and they went back to work in the late afternoon light. Two people who knew the ground they were standing on was compromised and chose to stand on it anyway, and the trees her grandfather had planted stood around them without judgment, alive after all this time, waiting to see what would grow. Gideon Whitmore came home on a Tuesday, 2 days earlier than his letter had said. Claire was in the barn when she heard the horse on the road, and for one disoriented second her first thought was Lucas, the way it always was now when she heard hooves on the gravel, a reflex she hadn't meant to develop and hadn't fully noticed until this moment, when the horse that came through the gate was the wrong color, and the man in the saddle was 20 years older and thinner than she remembered him being, as though Billings had taken something out of him that hadn't been put back. She came out of the barn with her hands still dirty and her heart doing something complicated. "Papa," she said. Gideon Whitmore dismounted with the careful movements of a man whose knees had been arguing with him for years and wouldn't be argued back. He was 63 years old, and he looked it today in a way he sometimes didn't. The gray in his hair gone fully white at the temples, the lines in his face cut deeper than she remembered. But his eyes were the same, dark and direct, and carrying everything he'd ever felt without apology. He looked at her for a moment, and then he pulled her into a hug that was brief and tight and said more than either of them would have managed in words. He smelled like trail dust and the particular tobacco he'd smoked since before she was born. "You look tired," he said when he let go. "I'm fine, you're early." Harlan's company was wearing on me. He looked past her at the property, doing what he always did when he came back. The sweep, the inventory, measuring what had changed against what he'd left. She watched him do it, and felt the particular tension of a person waiting for a specific thing to be noticed. He noticed the fence first. She saw his eyes track the south pasture line and pause. "You fixed the storm damage. Storm hit while you were gone, 3 sections down." "I can see that." He was still looking. "Looks like more than 3 sections worth of work." "I had help." He turned and looked at her then. Not suspiciously, more the way a father looks when he hears something in his daughter's voice that he hasn't heard before and is trying to place it. Who helped? She'd thought about this. She'd had 3 weeks to think about how this conversation would go, what she would say, how she would say it. She'd run through 17 versions of it in her head while she worked the orchard clearing, while she lay awake in the early mornings, while she sat at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold. Every version had felt wrong. "A neighbor," she said. "Come inside. I'll put food on." He followed her inside, and she felt him not asking the follow-up question the way you feel weather coming. The pressure of it, the shape of what was about to happen. She got the stove going, and he sat at the table, and she moved around the kitchen doing familiar things with her back to him, and she thought if she could just get through the meal, if they could just talk about something else for a little while, she could find a better way in. "What neighbor?" he asked. She'd known he wouldn't wait. Gideon Whitmore had never been a man who waited when he wanted an answer. She turned around. She held his gaze and said it plainly, the way she'd decided was the only honest way. Lucas Blackwood. The kitchen went very quiet. Her father's face did something she didn't have a word for. It wasn't anger, not immediately. It was something before anger, something rawer, like a man who's been struck and hasn't yet decided what to do about it. What? He said. He was thrown from his horse in the storm. I found him by the east fence. He was badly hurt, Papa. Fever, a head wound. I couldn't leave him there. Claire. His voice was very controlled. That was what scared her more than shouting would have. Tell me you didn't bring a Blackwood onto this property. He stayed in the north cabin. He was sick for 3 days. After he recovered, he helped with the repairs. Her father stood up from the table. He didn't raise his voice. He went to the window and stood there with his back to her and his hands at his sides, and the set of his shoulders said everything his voice wasn't saying yet. Where is he now? He asked. At his own ranch. He's been going back and forth. We've been working on the orchard together, the East Ridge section, the one grandfather planted. I've been clearing it, getting it ready to… Stop! He turned around. His face had gone the color of old ash, and his eyes were doing something she hadn't seen since the night her mother died. That wild, cornered quality, like a man who can't find a way out of something. You stop right there. You've been working with him, on this land. For how long? 6 weeks. The number hit him like a physical thing. 6 weeks. He said it very quietly. A Blackwood, on Whitmore land, working your mother's orchard. He looked at her, and what was in his face was not just anger, it was betrayal, deep and old and personal. Do you know what that family did to us? Do you know what that name means? I know what you told me, she said. I know your version of my version. Now his voice climbed. My version. Claire, I watched your mother run into that burning building. I watched the wall come down. That's not a version of anything. That is what happened. And Elias Blackwood was standing right there when it did, and he didn't… He stopped. His jaw worked. He didn't do what a man should do. He got out, and she didn't. And for 20 years that man has lived 20 miles from this house and never once, not once, said a word about it. Never came to us. Never explained himself. Nothing. Claire stood very still. What do you mean, explained himself? What was there to explain? Her father looked at her. Something flickered in his face, something complicated and quickly suppressed, a flash of something that might have been uncertainty, gone so fast she almost missed it. His family started that fire, he said. Their carelessness. Something happened over there that night that they never told anyone about. How do you know his family started it? Because I know what I saw. What did you see? He looked at her for a long moment. I saw the building go up. I saw the direction it spread. I saw Elias Blackwood come running out of there without my wife. His voice cracked on the last 3 words, and he stopped, and she saw him press it back down with the visible effort of a man who'd been pressing things down for 2 decades. That's enough for me. Is it enough to be certain? She said carefully. Papa, is seeing a man come out of a burning building enough to know that he started it? The kitchen went silent in a way that had a specific texture to it. Not peaceful silence. The silence of something that's been held in a particular shape for a very long time and is starting, very slightly, to shift. He should have gone back in, her father said finally. His voice was different now. Lower, less controlled, something raw underneath it. Even if he didn't start it, he should have gone back in. Maybe he tried, she said. He didn't. How do you know? Because your mother is dead and Elias Blackwood is alive. He said it with a finality that closed the conversation like a fist. He turned back to the window. I want him off my land. I want you to stop seeing him, stop working with him, stop whatever it is you've been building with him, and I want it done today. She stood at the stove with the heat of it against her back and looked at her father's rigid shoulders and thought about Lucas finding those letters, about his voice when he'd said, I just want it to be true, about the orchard in the afternoon light, the old trees standing in rows after years of waiting, the cleared ground where new things were trying to grow. No, she said. Her father turned around very slowly. I'm not ending something that hasn't done any harm, she said. I'm not doing it based on a story that might not be complete. And I am not… Her own voice was shaking now, and she hadn't expected that. "I am not going to spend my whole life being angry on your behalf at people who might not deserve it. I love you. You know I love you, but this is my land too and my life too, and I won't— Your mother is buried on this property." His voice had gone very quiet again, which was worse. "She is in the ground on the east side of this ranch because of that family. You want to grow an orchard on her memory with a Blackwood boy and tell me that's your right." The words landed exactly where he'd aimed them. She felt them the way you feel a fall. The initial shock, the slow arrival of pain. She didn't say anything. "Get him off my land," her father said. "We're done talking about this." He walked out of the kitchen, and she heard his boots on the stairs and then the sound of the bedroom door, not slammed, but closed, which somehow felt worse. She stood at the stove for a long time. Then she walked outside and stood on the porch and looked at the mountains and breathed. She didn't send for Lucas that day. She worked the property alone, the way she'd worked it before he came, and told herself she was thinking clearly and knew she wasn't. That night she sat at the kitchen table after her father had come down for supper, a meal they'd eaten in near silence, him reading a 2-week-old newspaper and her moving food around her plate. And she wrote a note. "My father came home. He saw the saddle before I could explain. I need you to know what's coming so you're not caught without warning. He blames your family for the fire. He believes it with everything he has. I don't know what the truth is, but you need to find out now. Whatever's in those letters, find it now." She wrote it over to the Blackwood boundary line at first light and left it with the fence post at the corner, where they developed the habit of leaving messages for each other when a ride all the way to the other property wasn't practical. She didn't know if he'd check it that day. She didn't know what he'd do with it when he did. She rode home and went back to work and tried not to think about any of it. Lucas found the note that afternoon. He read it standing at the fence post, reading it twice because the first time his eyes moved over it without the words quite landing. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his coat pocket and stood there looking across at the edge of the Whitmore property, the timberline where the two ranches met, for a long time. He'd known this was coming. He'd known it the way you know about weather. Not the exact day, not the exact shape of the storm, but the general direction of it. He'd bought himself 6 weeks and a beginning of something he hadn't expected to find. And now the bill was coming due, and he wasn't ready. And being not ready was not the same thing as having a choice. He went to his father's house that evening. Elias Blackwood was 71 years old and had the body of a man who had worked hard his whole life and bore the evidence of it in his hands, his back, the careful way he moved through his own kitchen as though he'd negotiated a treaty with his joints that required good behavior on both sides. He was still sharp in his mind. Lucas had always been grateful for that. Still direct in his speech, still the kind of man who looked you in the eye when he talked to you. Except on certain subjects. On certain subjects, his eyes went somewhere else. Lucas sat down at his father's kitchen table, the same table he'd sat at as a boy, the same scratch on the left corner where he'd dragged a spur across it at age 9 and gotten the only real hiding of his childhood, and said, "I need to talk to you about the Whitmore fire." Elias had his back to him, pouring coffee. Lucas watched the slight change in his father's posture. Not dramatic, just a tightening, a gathering inward. "That's old ground," Elias said. "I know it is. I need you to walk it with me anyway." Elias turned around. His eyes found his son's face and stayed there. He set the coffee down and pulled out the chair across the table and sat, slowly, with the care of a man whose hips made sitting down a project. "You found the letters," he said. Lucas looked at him. "You knew I'd been looking. I raised you. I know how you move through a house." A pause. "I've been waiting for this conversation for 6 months. Then why didn't you start it?" "Because I was hoping I wouldn't have to." Elias wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. His hands were shaking slightly, Lucas noticed. Not the tremor of old age, the other kind. "What do the letters tell you?" "That you were there. That you knew the Whitmore woman. That you wrote to someone. I couldn't figure out who, the letters don't have names, about what happened that night, and that you never sent what you wrote." Lucas kept his voice level. "The unsent letters are the ones that scared me. A man only keeps an unsent letter when he can't let go of what he needed to say, and couldn't." Elias looked at the table. He was quiet for long enough that Lucas started to wonder if this was going to be another deflection, another careful non-answer, and then his father said, "The lightning hit the old hay storage at the east end of the property. Not mine, the Whitmore land, just over the boundary. I saw it go up from my field. I was working late. He paused. This was 20 years ago, in the summer. You remember that summer, the dry one. Everything was ready to burn. I remember, Lucas said. He'd been a young man then, 23 and newly gone to Wyoming. He'd heard about the fire from a distance, secondhand, and hadn't known what to make of it. By the time he'd understood what people were saying, the story had already calcified into the version the valley told. Blackwood land, Blackwood fault. Whitmore woman dead. The lightning started it, Elias said. He said it directly, looking at his son. I want you to hear that clearly. Whatever else I tell you tonight, the lightning started that fire. It wasn't carelessness on anyone's part. It wasn't anything I did or didn't do before that moment. Lucas nodded. All right, then what? I ran toward it, because that's what you do when you see a neighbor's building on fire. You run toward it. I was thinking about the horses they kept in the lower barn. I was thinking about getting there before it spread to the main structure. He stopped. His jaw worked. When I got to the east section, the hay storage was already gone. The fire had jumped to the equipment shed, and coming through the gate, running from the main house, was Margaret Whitmore. Lucas went very still. She'd seen it from the window, Elias said. She was that kind of woman, the kind who ran toward trouble. She came through the gate, and she saw me, and she said, "There are children in the old bunkhouse, Elias." And she was already running before she finished the sentence. Children, Lucas said. Ranch hands' children. 3 of them, sleeping in the old bunkhouse on the near side of the equipment shed. Their father was in town. Elias's voice had gone rougher. Margaret went in through the east door. I went around to find another way in. The east door was already too hot. The fire was moving faster than... He stopped. I found a window. I got the children out through the window. All 3 of them. The youngest one was 4 years old, and she didn't understand what was happening, and I had to carry her, and she was fighting me, and I... He stopped again. Lucas waited. I got them out, Elias said. And then I went back for Margaret, and the east wall was down. It came down. Like that. The whole east wall. He put his face in his hands for a moment, and then pulled them away and looked at his son with eyes that had 20 years of something in them that Lucas recognized now for what it was. I went in through what was left of the window anyway. I was in there for, I don't know how long. There was a lantern on a hook near the window, and when I came through, it caught my coat, and I pulled it down trying to put it out, and it hit the floor, and the fire was already bad, but that made it worse, made it spread to the far corner faster. He paused. I found her. I got to her. But the smoke she wasn't... He stopped. And this time the silence was absolute and terrible. She was already gone, Lucas said quietly. She was already gone. Elias nodded. He aged 10 years in that nod. The east section collapsed behind me while I was carrying her out. I barely made it through. A beam came down and hit my shoulder, and I went down in the yard, and the next thing I knew, Gideon Whitmore was there. What did he see? Lucas asked. He saw me come out of a burning building without his wife. He saw the lantern I'd knocked down, making the fire worse than it should have been. He saw his children. Your sister was there. She was 6. He saw his daughter being carried by a ranch hand and his wife not there, and Elias looked at the table. And I was on the ground in the yard, and I couldn't tell him. I couldn't find the words. His wife was dead, and I had been in there, and his face when he looked at me was, "So you said nothing," Lucas said. I said nothing. The kitchen was very quiet. Lucas looked at his father, at this man he'd spent 12 years being frustrated with, being distant from, coming back to, and tried to hold all the parts of what he'd just heard at once. The lightning. Margaret Whitmore running toward the fire. The children. The lantern. The wall coming down. You saved those children, Lucas said. I couldn't save her. Elias said it like the other thing hadn't happened, like the saving of 3 lives existed in a different account from the one that mattered. She went in to get them, and I got them out, and she died. And Gideon... He stopped. Gideon blamed you, Lucas said. He's been blaming you for 20 years. Yes. And you let him. His father looked at him. He needed somewhere to put it. The words hit Lucas in a place he hadn't been braced for. He sat with them for a moment, turned them over, looked at the underside of them. He needed somewhere to put it. That's not... Papa, that's not... He stopped and started again. That's not right. What you did... Stop. staying silent, letting him build 20 years of hatred on something that wasn't true. It wasn't entirely untrue, Elias said quietly. The lantern was in my hands. The fire was worse because of me. Margaret Whitmore died in a corner of that building because the fire moved faster than it should have, and the reason it moved faster is that you knocked a lantern while trying to save her life, Lucas said, in a burning building, while you were trying to reach a woman who was already gone. He heard his voice going hard and tried to bring it back. You have let a man hate you for 20 years for an accident that happened while you were trying to help. You let him tell his daughter. You let Claire grow up thinking. He stopped. Elias looked at him. Something shifted in the older man's face. Claire, he said. Not a question. More like a man placing a piece in a puzzle he'd only just been handed. She's been working with me, Lucas said. On her property. He stopped because the full weight of it was arriving now. What Claire had known, what she hadn't said, what she'd been carrying on his behalf without knowing the shape of it. She knows there's something wrong with the story she was given. She just doesn't know what. She's Gideon's daughter, Elias said, studying him. Yes. And you've been working with her for weeks. His father's eyes were doing the same measuring thing his own eyes did, the thing that must be inherited. Lucas. I know. Does Gideon know? He does now. Lucas pushed back from the table and stood up because he couldn't stay sitting. He went to the window and looked out at the dark of the Blackwood property. The familiar dark. The particular way the mountains looked from this window. The silhouette he'd grown up with. He came home early. He saw the Blackwood brand. Claire told me he'd reacted badly, that's an understatement based on what I know about Gideon Whitmore. He's not a bad man, Elias said. He was a man who lost his wife. Stop making excuses for people, Lucas said sharply. Then, sorry. Don't apologize for it. You're right. Elias was quiet for a moment. What are you going to do? Lucas turned around. What are you going to do? His father looked at him with those 20-year eyes. Whatever you think is right. I think you should tell him, Lucas said. I think you should go to Gideon Whitmore and tell him exactly what you told me, and I think you should let him do what he's going to do with it. And I think 20 years of silence has cost everyone in this valley enough. His voice was harder than he meant it to be. He didn't entirely soften it. This isn't about your guilt, Papa. It stopped being just about your guilt a long time ago. There are other people paying the price of your silence, and they haven't had the choice you had. Elias looked at the table for a long time. Lucas watched his father's face do the slow work of a man recalibrating something fundamental. Not resisting it exactly, but measuring the distance between where he was and where he needed to get. He won't believe me, Elias said finally. He's had 20 years to build what he believes. Maybe not right away. Lucas came back to the table but didn't sit. But right now he's building more of it. Right now he's in that house telling Claire she can't see me, that no Blackwood is welcome on Whitmore land, and she's having to choose between her father and the truth, because your silence means nobody in that family has ever had access to the truth. He paused. That's on you. That part is entirely on you. Elias flinched, just slightly. Lucas had never in his life spoken to his father quite like this directly, this without apology. And he waited for the old man's anger to surface, the defensive wall he'd watched his father build around difficult conversations for as long as he could remember. It didn't come. What came instead was something closer to relief. Terrible and old and exhausted and almost relief. All right, Elias said. Lucas looked at him. All right? All right. I'll go. He put his hands flat on the table and pushed himself upright, and Lucas watched him stand and thought that the man looked different than he'd looked an hour ago. Not younger, not lighter, but different in the way things look when they've been set down after being carried too long. Not tonight. I'm not going to that man's house in the dark and knock on his door, but tomorrow. He looked at his son. Will you come with me? No, Lucas said. I won't. You need to go alone. Elias blinked. This has to be between you and him first, Lucas said. Before it's anything else, it has to be that. You going to him and saying the true thing to his face without me there to complicate what it means. He held his father's gaze. Can you do that? A long moment. Elias Blackwood looked at his son, and then he looked at the window, and then he looked at his hands on the kitchen table. Yes, he said. I can do that. Lucas nodded. He picked up his hat from the chair. Good. Lucas? His father's voice stopped him at the door. The girl, Claire Whitmore. Lucas turned. What is she to you? Elias asked. Not unkindly, with a frankness that Lucas recognized as the family's one unbreakable habit, the tendency, at the end of everything, to ask the direct question. Lucas thought about it, about the mud and the storm and the fever, about fence posts and the orchard and the afternoon light through apple trees, about a note left on a boundary fence and what it had cost her to write it. Something I didn't expect, he said, and something I don't intend to give up on the basis of a story that was never complete. His father looked at him for a long moment. Something moved in the old man's face, something private and a little painful, the expression of a person recognizing something they caused without meaning to. I'm sorry, Elias said, for what my silence made harder. You can tell Gideon Whitmore that tomorrow, Lucas said. That's where the apology needs to go. He put on his hat and walked out into the dark and stood on his father's porch for a moment, letting the cold air do what cold air does. The mountains were black shapes against a sky that had too many stars in it, the way Montana sky always did, indifferent and enormous and not interested in the small human mess below it. He thought about Claire standing in the kitchen telling her father no. He thought about Gideon Whitmore's grief, 20 years old and still sharp enough to cut. He thought about a woman running into a burning building and a man carrying 3 children out of a window and a lantern knocked from a hook in the chaos of trying to save someone who was already beyond saving. He thought about how a single night's terrible, ordinary tragedy simplified over 2 decades into a story of blame and hatred clean enough to pass from one generation to the next, like an inheritance nobody wanted. He stood there until the cold made its point, then went to check on his horses. Back on the Whitmore property, Claire sat at her kitchen table in the hour after supper and listened to her father move around upstairs. She could track him by sound, the particular creak of the board outside the bedroom, the sound of the window being opened, the small domestic sounds of a man who was not sleeping but did not want to come back downstairs and resume a conversation neither of them had finished. She had the note she'd written to Lucas on the table in front of her, or rather the absence of it. She'd sent it, and she didn't know what he'd done with it. And she didn't know if his father had said anything or if there was anything to say. She only knew what her father believed and what she suspected and the vast uncomfortable distance between those two things. She thought about what her father had said. He should have gone back in. The weight those words carried, the particular shape of what they revealed. Not just accusation, but something older and more personal. The belief not just that Elias Blackwood had started the fire, but that when it mattered, when Margaret Whitmore's life had been the cost of cowardice, he had chosen himself. She didn't know if that was true. She didn't know, and that not knowing had been sitting in her chest since before she'd ever met Lucas Blackwood, since the first time she'd been old enough to ask her father questions, and had started to notice the places where his answers didn't quite meet the edges of what he claimed to know. She got up and went to the window and looked out at the dark pasture and then at the tree line where the Blackwood land began. Tomorrow something was going to happen. She didn't know what shape it would take, whether it would be her father or Lucas or something none of them had anticipated, but she could feel it in the quality of the night, the way she felt weather, the pressure of something gathering. She went to bed and lay awake and listened to Montana being quiet outside her window, and she thought that the trouble with truth was not finding it. The trouble with truth was what you had to give up to let it in. Elias Blackwood rode to the Whitmore Ranch on a Wednesday morning, alone, on a horse he'd had for 11 years. He didn't tell anyone on his property where he was going. He didn't leave a note. He got up before his crew was awake, before the sky had fully decided what color it was going to be. And he saddled the horse himself the way he'd been doing since he was 14 years old. And he rode the 20 miles between the 2 ranches at a pace that suggested a man who had made a decision and was not going to give himself time to reconsider it. He'd been awake most of the night, not anxious exactly, or not only anxious. More the way a person is awake when they've been carrying something for a very long time and have finally put it down and can't quite remember how to sleep without the weight of it. He'd lain in the dark and gone through what he was going to say, not rehearsing exactly, more just making sure the truth was in the right order in his mind. Because the truth, in his experience, had a way of coming out scrambled when you were frightened, and he was frightened, and he needed it to come out straight. The Whitmore gate was closed when he arrived. He dismounted and opened it himself, the way a neighbor would, not the way a man who expected to be turned away would, and led his horse through and up the long approach to the main house. Claire saw him first. She was coming out of the barn with a bucket when she saw the unfamiliar horse at the gate and stopped walking. Then she recognized the rider and stopped breathing for a moment. Elias Blackwood was a tall man, or had been, age had taken some of it, with the broad build that Lucas had inherited and the same careful, deliberate way of moving. He led his horse up the path, and when he saw her, he stopped and took off his hat. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I'm looking for your father." She set the bucket down. Her heart was doing something fast and unsteady. "He's inside." "Would you get him for me?" She looked at this old man, this name she'd grown up fearing, this face she'd never actually seen until this moment, and tried to read what was in it. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't the way she'd imagined him in 20 years of her father's stories, which had given him a kind of monster's blankness, the flatness of a man who felt nothing. What she saw instead was someone who looked like he'd aged 20 years overnight and had come here anyway. "Wait here," she said. She went inside. Her father was at the kitchen table with his coffee and the newspaper he'd already read twice, the way he always was in the mornings. The ritual of it, the sameness, the comfort of a routine that didn't ask anything of him. He looked up when she came in. "Elias Blackwood is at the gate," she said. The coffee cup went down with a sound that wasn't quite controlled. "He's alone," she said quickly. "He came alone, Papa. He just asked to speak to you." Her father's face cycled through several things in fast succession: shock, fury, something that might have been fear, then the familiar hardening that she'd watched grief build in him over 20 years, the jaw setting, the eyes going flat. He started to push back from the table. "I'll send him." "Don't." She stepped into his path. Not touching him, she knew better than to physically stop him when he looked like this, but placing herself between him and the door with enough intention that he had to acknowledge her. "Papa, he came here alone. He came here voluntarily. Whatever else is true, that means something." "It means nothing," Gideon said. "Then hear him out and send him away with a clear conscience. But if you send him away without hearing what he came to say, you'll spend the rest of your life wondering what it was." She held his gaze. "You've already spent 20 years wondering things. Is that how you want 20 more to go?" Her father looked at her. There was something working in his face that she couldn't entirely read. The complicated interior of a man who was angry and grieving and 63 years old and had driven a particular story so deep into himself that pulling at it felt like pulling at something structural. "Step aside, Claire," he said quietly. She stepped aside. Because she'd said what she had to say and it wasn't her confrontation to manage, and she knew it. He walked out the front door. She followed as far as the porch. Elias Blackwood was standing at the bottom of the porch steps with his hat in his hands. His horse was tied at the post. He looked up when Gideon came through the door, and he didn't flinch, which Claire noticed, and she thought that took something, standing at the bottom of those steps and not flinching at what was in Gideon Whitmore's face. The two men looked at each other for a long moment without speaking. They were the same age, roughly. They'd grown up in the same valley, had known each other's names since boyhood, had been neighbors. Not friends, but neighbors, which in Montana meant something particular for most of their adult lives. And then the fire, and 20 years of nothing. "You have some nerve," Gideon said. His voice was very controlled. "Coming here." "Yes," Elias said. "I do." A pause. "I need to talk to you about the fire, Gideon. I need you to let me say what I should have said 20 years ago, and I need you to listen before you say anything, because what I'm going to tell you is going to be hard to hear, and I don't want to have to fight my way through it. Get off my land." "Not yet." Elias held his ground. "After. If you want me gone after, I'll go, but not before." Gideon's hands were at his sides, and his face was doing that thing Claire had seen the night her father had told her his version of events. The wild, cornered quality. The man who can't find a way out. He looked at Elias Blackwood, and what he was looking at, Claire understood, was 20 years of a story he'd built his survival on. And stories you've built your survival on are not easy things to let someone near. "You have 5 minutes," Gideon said. The words came out like something he hated having to say. Elias nodded once. He took a breath, and Claire watched his chest settle on the exhale, and then he began. He told it the same way he'd told Lucas. The lightning, the direction of the fire, running toward it from his field. He told it plainly and without decoration, standing at the bottom of those porch steps with his hat in his hands and his eyes on Gideon Whitmore's face. He didn't look away when he talked about Margaret running through the gate. He didn't look away when he talked about the children in the bunkhouse. His voice was steady and quiet, and the steadiness of it was not the steadiness of a man who wasn't feeling anything. It was the other kind, the kind that costs. Gideon didn't move, didn't speak. Claire watched her father's face from the porch and couldn't tell what was happening in it. It had gone very still in a way that scared her more than the anger had. When Elias got to the window, to the children, to carrying the youngest one out while she fought him, his voice changed slightly. Not breaking, but that wasn't the right word. Just acquiring a texture it hadn't had before. The texture of something that had been lived rather than rehearsed. "I got them out," Elias said. "All three. The youngest one bit me on the shoulder hard enough to leave a scar. I still have it." He paused. "Then I went back for Margaret." Gideon made a sound. Very small. He may not have known he made it. The east window was still passable. I went through it. There was a lantern on the hook beside the window frame, and when I came through, my coat caught the chain and I pulled it down trying to free myself, and it went to the floor. He stopped for a moment. The fire was already past saving. I knew that. But I went further in because I could hear, I thought I heard. I went in anyway. I found her in the far corner. She was already gone before I reached her. The smoke had... He stopped again. This time the pause was longer. She was gone. I carried her out anyway. I had her most of the way to the door when the east wall came down and a beam hit me and I went down in the yard. "Stop," Gideon said. It was barely a word, more like an exhale that happened to have shape. "I'm almost done," Elias said quietly. "Please let me finish." Gideon said nothing, which was the same as yes. "When I came to, you were there. You were standing over me in your face." Elias looked at the man across from him. "I have seen a lot of things in my life, Gideon. I've never seen anything like your face in that moment. And I tried to tell you. I want you to know that I tried. I opened my mouth, and what came out was nothing. Because she was dead, and I had been inside that building, and I couldn't... The words weren't there." He pressed his hands around the brim of his hat, a small, controlled motion. "And then you looked at me the way you looked at me, and I saw what you believed, and I..." He stopped. "I let you believe it. Because I thought you needed something to be angry at. Because I thought if I told you the truth, that your wife ran toward a fire of her own choosing, that she was gone before I ever reached her, that there was nothing anyone could have done differently. I thought that would be worse. I thought anger was easier than nothing." The morning was very quiet around them. A horse in the paddock. Wind in the tree line. The ordinary sounds of a ranch in the early hours, indifferent to what was happening on the porch. "I was wrong," Elias said. "I understand that now, and I understood it probably within 6 months of that night, and I carried being wrong about it for 20 years because I didn't know how to undo it. And I am genuinely sorry, not for being there, not for what happened with the lantern, which I would do again if it meant getting those children out, but for the silence, for letting you build 20 years on something that wasn't true." He paused. "That's what I came to say." Gideon Whitmore stood on his porch and didn't speak for a very long time. Claire had stopped breathing somewhere around the lantern. She made herself breathe now, quietly, and watched her father's face and waited. What happened to Gideon Whitmore's face in the silence after Elias finished speaking was not simple and it was not quick. It was the visible process of a man whose entire structural understanding of a devastating event was being asked to reorganize itself, and that kind of reorganization doesn't happen cleanly or fast. She watched him fight it, actually fight it, jaw tight, eyes bright with something that was not quite tears but was in the same territory. And she watched the fighting and the believing happen simultaneously, which was the hardest thing to watch because it meant the truth was landing even as everything in him resisted it. "The lightning started it," he said finally. His voice had changed, flattened. "Yes." "And Margaret..." He stopped, tried again. "Margaret ran toward it on her own." "Yes, she saw it from the house. She came through the gate running. I couldn't have stopped her." Elias paused. "I'm not sure anyone could have stopped Margaret Whitmore from running toward a fire if she thought there were children in it. You knew her better than I did. You know that's true." Something moved through Gideon's face. complex and private and painful. The expression of a man hearing his dead wife described accurately by someone else. The particular grief of recognizing the person in the description. Yes, he said quietly. That's true. Another silence. Longer. Elias didn't push it. He stood at the bottom of the steps and waited with the patience of a man who had waited 20 years for this conversation and could wait a little longer for the space after it. The children, Gideon said. The parish children. Yes. They're grown now. 2 of them still in the valley. I know. Gideon looked at him. They know what you did? No. A pause. Their father knew. I told him. Some years later. He cried. He was a good man, Harlan Parrish. I didn't deserve to not know. Elias looked at the porch boards at Gideon's feet. I should have told you too, a long time ago. I know that. Gideon turned away from him. He walked to the far end of the porch and stood there with his back to both of them, to Elias at the bottom of the steps, and to Claire behind him. And he put his hands on the porch rail and stood there for what felt like a very long time. Claire didn't move. Elias didn't move. Even the horses in the paddock seemed to have gone quiet. When Gideon turned around, his face looked older. Not devastated, older. Like something had been set down that had been aging him faster than time. And without it, he was just his actual age. And his actual age was considerable and had its own weight. Get off my porch rail, Claire, he said. I can feel you hovering. She straightened up from the rail she'd been holding without realizing it. Sorry. Go do something useful. But his voice had none of the hardness it had carried for the past 2 days. He looked at Elias. Come up here and sit down, he said. I need coffee, and you look like you need it too. Elias looked up at him for a moment. Whatever was in his face, Claire couldn't name it, but it was complicated and genuine, and she turned away from it because it felt like something she shouldn't watch. She went inside and put the coffee on and stayed in the kitchen while the 2 men sat on the porch. She could hear them through the window. Not the words, just the cadence of voices, which told her more than words would have anyway. The starts and stops of it, the long pauses, the way the rhythm of it changed over time from something tight and formal to something looser, which didn't mean easier, but meant that the walls were not being held quite so rigidly. She didn't go back out to the porch. She made coffee and brought it out and set it on the small table between the 2 chairs, and went back inside without being asked and without asking herself why. She understood that this was not her conversation. She had delivered it. She and Lucas both had, in their separate ways. And now it belonged to the 2 old men sitting in the morning light, and the best thing she could do was leave them to it. She went to the barn and did the morning chores with a thoroughness that had less to do with the barn needing it and more to do with having somewhere to put her hands. She fed the horses. She cleaned the stalls. She checked the tack with more care than she usually gave it. She worked her way through every task she could find until the sun was fully up and the barn was cleaner than it had been in years, and her arms were tired. When she came back to the house, her father was alone on the porch. Elias's horse was gone from the post. Gideon was sitting in one of the porch chairs with his coffee gone cold in his hand and his eyes on the middle distance, the particular unfocused look of a man still working something through. She sat down in the other chair. She didn't speak. She'd learned from her father, ironically, the value of not speaking too quickly into silence. He saved those children, Gideon said finally. I know. Harlan Parrish's kids. He looked at the cold coffee in his hand. Annie Parrish is married now, lives down past the Henderson place. She's got 3 kids of her own. He was quiet for a moment. She wouldn't be alive if... He stopped. I know, Claire said again. He knocked a lantern down. Her father's voice was careful, feeling its way. Trying to get to Margaret. He was inside a burning building trying to get to her, and he knocked a lantern down. Yes. That's not... He stopped, looked at his hands. That's not what I thought. She waited. I thought he was careless, Gideon said. I thought he did something stupid and selfish, and I spent 20 years thinking he just got out because he didn't care enough to go back in, because the Blackwood name was more important than my wife's life. His jaw tightened. That's what I told myself. That's what I told you. I know, Papa. That's what I told you, he said again with more weight. You grew up with that being the truth of it. He looked at her. I'm sorry for that. She was not entirely prepared for that. She'd been prepared for many things this morning, but not specifically for her father apologizing to her, and she felt it in her throat in a way that was inconvenient and real. "You believed it," she said. "I believed what I needed to believe." He put the coffee cup down on the porch rail with a small, deliberate motion. "Which is not the same thing as the truth, and I should have known the difference." He was quiet for a moment. "Your mother would have known the difference. Margaret always said I was too quick to settle on a story and too slow to revise it." Something moved across his face that was private enough that Claire looked away from it. She wasn't wrong about that. They sat with that for a while. The morning was warming, the way Montana mornings do when the sun finally gets properly above the ridge and the cold recedes and everything smells like pine and turned earth, and the particular cleanness of a place that hasn't been broken by too many people. "What did he say when he left?" Claire asked. "He said he'd come back if I wanted to talk more. He said he didn't expect anything from me. Not forgiveness, not friendship, nothing." Gideon paused. "He said he just needed me to know what actually happened, that it was the only thing he could still give to your mother, making sure the truth of that night existed somewhere outside of him." Claire sat with that. The particular honesty of it, the way Elias had framed it, not for himself, or at least not only for himself, but as something owed to a woman who'd been dead for 20 years. She thought about Margaret Whitmore, who she knew mostly from photographs and her father's stories and the particular shape of her own face in the mirror, which everyone said favored her mother's, running toward the fire, not because she hadn't understood the danger, but because she had, and had made a choice. "She'd have done the same thing even if she'd known," Claire said. "You know that." "Yes," Gideon said. "I know." He looked out at the property, at the south fence line, the repaired sections, at the mountains beyond. "He didn't start it." "No. Lightning started it. Yes. And she—" He stopped. "She made her own choice. To go in." He said it slowly, the way a man says something he's been actively not saying for a very long time. "She made her own choice. That's—" Another stop. "I'm not sure I like that better," he said quietly. "I'm not sure knowing she chose it is easier than thinking someone was responsible." "I know," Claire said. "I think maybe that's why it's the truth, because the truth doesn't ask you to like it." Her father looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, the slight recalibration that happened when she said something that surprised him, that reminded him she'd been thinking about things he hadn't always given her credit for thinking about. "Lucas Blackwood," he said. She held very still. "You care about him." It wasn't a question. Her father was many things, and he'd always been able to read her, even when she'd preferred he couldn't. "Yes," she said. There was no point in going around it. Gideon nodded slowly. He didn't say anything for a while. She watched him work through it, the layered complexity of his daughter telling him she cared about the son of the man he'd hated for 20 years, and the fact that the 20 years of hatred had just been, if not dismantled, then fundamentally complicated, and the fact that his wife would probably have had something clear and accurate to say about all of it, that he was now going to have to work out for himself without her. "Is he a good man?" Gideon asked. She thought about it seriously, the way the question deserved. "I think so. I think he's trying to be, and I think he's honest about the places where trying is hard." She paused. "He was the one who pushed his father to come here. He found out what happened, most of it, from the letters his father kept, and when he understood what the silence had been doing, he made his father end it." She looked at her father. "He could have stayed out of it. It would have been easier." "Easier," Gideon repeated. He said it like a word he'd been examining and finding less and less use for. "Your mother had no patience for easier." I was quiet for a moment. "Neither do you much." She didn't say anything to that. "I'm not ready to have him here for supper," Gideon said finally. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not—" Elias Blackwood walked off my porch this morning, and I'm not going to pretend that 20 years comes apart in one conversation over cold coffee. "I know," Claire said, "but I'm not going to tell you he can't come on this property." He said it carefully, the way a man says something that costs him something. "I'm not going to tell you that anymore." She looked at her father, at the lines in his face and the white at his temples and the way his hands rested on the porch rail, a little looser than they'd been. Not at peace, not finished, but slightly unburdened. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," he said gruffly. I'm doing it badly and slowly, and I reserve the right to be difficult about it." "I know," she said. "That's fine." He made a sound that was almost something like a laugh. "Your mother would have had this sorted in about a week," he said. "Probably less," Claire said. He looked at her, and this time the thing on his face was grief of a different quality. Less sharp, more settled. The particular grief of someone who has just remembered a person they love accurately, rather than through the distorting glass of anger and blame. It was private enough that she almost looked away, but she didn't, because she thought he needed someone to stay with it. "Go send word to him," Gideon said eventually. "The Blackwood boy. Tell him his father came and said what he needed to say. Tell him I heard it." She stood up. "Is that all?" Her father looked out at the property. "Tell him the south pasture fence his father supposedly built 40 years ago was never set right, and it's been causing drainage problems since before I can remember. And if he's got ideas about that, I'd hear them." She stood there for a moment. She knew what that was. Her father's way of offering a door without calling it a door, extending something without having to name what he was extending. The infuriating, endearing practicality of a man for whom feelings were easier to transmit through fence posts and drainage problems than through direct speech. "All right," she said. "I'll tell him that." She rode the boundary line that afternoon and left a note at the fence post, as she'd been doing. But she'd only been back at the house for an hour when she heard hooves on the road and looked out to see Lucas coming through the gate, not waiting for the note, either because he'd been watching for her or because whatever his father had said when he got home had told him enough. She met him at the gate. He dismounted and looked at her and said, "My father came back about 2 hours ago. He didn't say much. He just sat at the kitchen table and looked like a man who'd put something down." A pause. "How did it go?" "He heard it," she said. "My father heard all of it." She looked up at Lucas. "It's not fixed. I want you to understand that. He's 63 years old, and he spent 20 years building something, and it doesn't come apart in a morning. But he heard it, and he said—" She paused. "He said the south pasture fence your father built 40 years ago was never set right, and it's been causing drainage problems. And if you've got ideas about it, he'd hear them." Lucas looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but the thing that happened to his eyes sometimes when he was moved by something and didn't have a clean way to express it. "That's a very Gideon Whitmore way to extend an olive branch," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." "Does he know what he's doing?" "He knows exactly what he's doing. He just needs it to look like ranch business." Lucas looked past her toward the main house, where Gideon Whitmore was visible through the kitchen window, pointedly reading his newspaper. Then he looked back at Claire. "And you?" he asked. "How are you?" She considered that. The actual answer was complicated. She was relieved and unsettled and tired in a way that sleep wouldn't fix, and also something else. Something that didn't have a clean name. Something that had to do with standing on the porch this morning and watching two old men sit together with the truth between them after 20 years of it being absent. "I'm all right," she said. "I think I'm actually all right." He nodded. He looked at her with that careful, honest quality he'd had since the first morning in the cabin. The quality of a man who actually listened to what you said and didn't try to adjust it into what he preferred to hear. "The letters," she said. "The ones you found. What happens with them now?" He thought about it. "I think my father needs to decide that. Some of them might matter to people still alive, the Parrish family. Some others." He paused. "But that's his to sort out. I pushed him to come here. The rest of it is between him and the people he owes honesty to." She nodded. "That's right." They stood at the gate for a moment in the afternoon light, two people on the boundary between two properties that had been divided by 20 years of a misunderstood tragedy, and the ground under them was still complicated, still imperfect, still carrying the weight of what had been built on it. But it was the actual ground now, not the ground someone had invented out of grief and need. An actual ground, however difficult, was something you could stand on without it shifting under you. "Come look at the south pasture fence," she said. "Tell me what you see." He tied his horse at the post and followed her through the gate, and they walked side by side through the property she'd grown up on. And she thought about her mother running toward a fire and an old man carrying a 4-year-old through a window, and her father sitting on the porch with cold coffee, and the particular way that truth moves through people, slowly, resistantly, at enormous cost, and then all at once. The fence, when they reached it, was in worse shape than either of them had quite realized from a distance. 3 rails loose, 2 posts sunk at the wrong angle, the whole south run listing slightly toward the low side of the slope, where the drainage problem had been quietly making things worse for decades. Lucas walked it slowly with his hands in his pockets, doing what he did. The methodical attention, the careful inventory. She walked beside him and let him look. "Your grandfather set the posts too shallow on the low side," he said after a while. "The frost heave's been working them loose every winter for probably since the beginning. You'd need to pull and reset the whole south run. Different depth, different angle." "How long?" "2 people, 3 days." He glanced at her. 4 if one of them is difficult about it. "My father is not going to pull fence posts with you after knowing you for one afternoon." "No," he said. "But I could come back Thursday, work the south section. He doesn't have to be friendly. He just has to be in the same county." She looked at him. "You'd do that." "The fence needs doing," he said simply. "And the faster it gets done, the faster the drainage improves. That's just practical." "You're using the fence." "I'm absolutely using the fence." He held her gaze. "Is that all right?" She thought about her father at the kitchen window with his newspaper, about Elias Blackwood riding home with 20 years of undelivered truth finally delivered, about 3 children who were now grown adults with children of their own, none of whom knew that a man named Elias Blackwood had carried them out of a burning building through a window while the youngest one bit his shoulder, about apple trees that had been waiting 40 years for someone to clear the ground around them and let them properly grow. "Yes," she said. "That's all right." They finished walking the fence line as the sun moved lower and the shadows stretched out long across the south pasture. Neither of them said anything that needed saying. Everything that needed saying had been said or was in the process of being understood, which was different from being said, and maybe better. When they got back to the gate, Gideon Whitmore was on the porch. He'd come out at some point during their walk, she didn't know when, and he was sitting in his chair with his hands on the armrests, looking at the mountains the way he did when he was thinking about something he didn't want to name yet. He looked at Lucas when they came through the gate. Lucas looked at him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The moment had a shape to it, weighted, complicated, carrying everything that was between their families and hadn't been resolved and wasn't going to be resolved quickly. Then Gideon Whitmore said, with the particular gruffness of a man who is saying something that costs him and is not going to soften it to make it sound like it doesn't, "The south pasture fence has been wrong since before you were born. If you've got an idea about it, come Thursday." Lucas looked at him steadily. "Yes, sir," he said. "I'll be here Thursday." Gideon nodded once, the kind of nod that closes a chapter, and looked back at the mountains. Claire stood between them at the gate, between her father on the porch and Lucas at the fence post, between the Whitmore land and the boundary that led to Blackwood ground, and felt the weight of the day, all of it, the grief and the truth, and the long work of undoing something that had been built badly over a long time. It wasn't finished. She knew that. Her father would have hard mornings with it still to come, and Elias Blackwood had people to tell the truth to, and there were things between these two families that would take seasons rather than days to properly address. But the south fence needed doing, and the orchard needed tending, and the 2 young trees she'd ordered from the supplier down south would be arriving before the end of April, and she'd been thinking about where to plant them, not in the main orchard rows, but somewhere visible, somewhere that meant something, though she hadn't yet worked out exactly where. She would figure that out. There was time now. That was the thing she hadn't expected, that after a morning like this one, with all its weight and all its difficulty, what she'd end up with was time. Not solutions. Not the clean resolution of a story tied off and finished. Just time, and the ground under her feet being what it actually was. And the work still to be done in front of her. She could do the work. She'd been doing it her whole life. Thursday came and Lucas came with it, as he'd said he would. He arrived early, before the dew had fully burned off the grass, with 2 of his men from the Blackwood ranch. Both of them quiet, capable, the kind of ranch hands who showed up knowing what they were there to do and didn't need to be told twice. He'd brought the right tools, the right posts, and a level that he set against the existing fence rail before he said a single word about the work, just to confirm what they already knew. Claire met him at the gate. She'd been up since before dawn with the particular restlessness of someone who knows a difficult day is coming and can't sleep their way past it. "My father's inside," she said. "He knows you're coming. He's not going to be warm about it." I'm not expecting warm, Lucas said. He might come out and watch, but that's fine. He might say something difficult. Lucas looked at her. Claire, I grew up with Elias Blackwood for a father. I have a reasonably high tolerance for difficult. He said it without sharpness, just plainly, and she let herself almost smile at it. All right, she said. The south section runs from the oak post to the property marker. You can see where it's listing. He could see. He'd already been looking. They started pulling posts at 8 in the morning. It was hard work. The old posts had been in the ground for 40 years and didn't want to come out. And the frost heave had done complicated things to the surrounding soil that made each extraction its own separate problem. Lucas worked alongside his men without standing back and directing, which she noticed, and which said something about how he understood the difference between being in charge and being useful. Gideon came out at 9. He didn't say anything at first. He came off the porch with his coffee and stood at a distance that was technically the distance of a man inspecting his own fence line, not the distance of a man watching other people work, though it was both. Claire watched him from the corner of her eye and kept her own hands busy with the wire stretcher on the far end. After about 20 minutes, Gideon walked closer. He stood behind Lucas for a moment, looking at the post extraction, and then he said, "You're going too shallow on the reset." Lucas stopped, looked at the post, looked at the depth mark he'd made. "I was going to 18 inches. This slope needs 22, Gideon said. Water table's higher than it looks. You'll have the same problem in 5 years if you go to 18. A pause. Lucas looked at the post hole, then at the slope, then at Gideon. "You're right," he said. 22. Gideon nodded once. He didn't leave. He stood there while Lucas's man reset the depth, and they pulled the post and started again, and after a few minutes, Gideon said something to the man about the angle of approach on the clay layer, and the man listened, and that was how it went. Not warmly, not easily, not with any pretense that things were fine between them, but with the specific common ground of two men who both knew this particular soil and this particular fence line and cared about the work being done right. Claire went to make lunch, and when she came back, her father was holding one end of a wire while Lucas's man stretched the other, which was not something she'd expected to see before the end of the month, let alone the end of the morning. She set the food on the porch rail and called them in, and the three men and Gideon ate together in the way men eat when they've been doing physical work, concentrated and quiet, with brief practical exchanges about the afternoon section and where the problem posts were and what the weather was likely to do by the end of the week. It wasn't forgiveness. She wasn't naive enough to call it that. But it was something, and something, she'd decided, was the honest unit of measurement for all of this. Not grand resolution, but actual incremental something, one fence post at a time. The fence took 2.5 days. At the end of it, the south section stood straight and true for the first time in 4 decades, and the drainage slope was correctly managed. And the two men who'd been on opposite sides of 20 years of misplaced hatred had not exchanged a single personal word, but they'd exchanged about 300 words on the subjects of soil composition, wire gauge, and what the winter was going to do to the north pasture, and that was where it had to start, and it had started. The supplier's delivery came on a Friday morning at the end of April. The new rootstock from down south, 12 trees packed in burlap and ready to plant. Claire had been waiting for them the way she'd been waiting for a lot of things lately, with more patience than she used to have, and a clearer sense of what she was waiting for. She and Lucas planted them over 2 days, not in the existing orchard rows, but in a new section she'd cleared to the south of the oldest trees, where the limestone layer ran closest to the surface and the afternoon light came longest. New ground, adjacent to the old, extending what her grandfather had started into something larger than he'd imagined. On the second day of planting, when they'd gotten to the last 2 trees, Lucas stopped and looked at the holes they'd prepared and said, "I want to ask you something." She looked up from the rootstock she was unwrapping. "I'm not going to frame it as anything other than what it is," he said. "I'm not going to dress it up or soften it or make it about practical things." He was looking at her with that direct quality she'd gotten used to and hadn't stopped finding unsettling in the good way. "I want to know if you'd consider building something permanent with me, not because of what's happened between our families, not to fix anything or prove anything to anyone, just because I want to, just because this—" He gestured at the cleared ground, the new trees, the old orchard visible beyond. "This is what I want to be working on, this specific ground, with you." She stood with the rootstock in her hands and looked at him. She thought about the mud and the storm, about a brand burned into leather and the choice she'd made in 30 seconds that had led to all of this. About her father eating lunch with a Blackwood man over fence talk, and Elias Blackwood carrying a 4-year-old through a burning window, and her mother running toward a fire because there were children inside and she was that kind of woman. About the truth moving through people, how it resists, how it costs, and then how it lands and stays. She thought about imperfect things, about how the fence they'd just rebuilt wasn't beautiful, it was functional, and it would need tending every few years, and that wasn't a problem. That was just what fences were. About how her father was not going to become a comfortable man about any of this, and that was all right too. About how she herself was not easy, and didn't sleep well when things were unresolved, and got defensive in ways she wasn't always proud of, and sometimes made decisions by kneeling in the mud next to strangers during lightning storms without thinking them all the way through. About how none of that made the thing less worth building. "Yes," she said. "I'd consider it." He looked at her for a moment. "That's the least romantic answer I've ever gotten to that kind of question." "I'm a practical woman," she said. "You knew that already." Something shifted in his face. That rare, real thing that happened to his expression when he was genuinely moved and wasn't hiding it. He crossed the short distance between them, and she let him. And the kiss was not dramatic in the way stories sometimes make these things. It was brief and real, and tasted like a day's worth of honest work. And when he pulled back, she was looking at him with the particular steadiness of someone who has made a decision and knows it. "Plant the trees," she said. He laughed. A real one, short and unguarded. The kind she hadn't heard from him often enough. "Yes, ma'am." They planted the last 2 trees as the afternoon light came long and gold across the new section. And Claire thought about where in this ground her grandfather's hands had worked, and where her own hands were working now, and what it meant that both sets of work existed in the same soil, layered, continuing. She didn't tell her father that day. She waited until evening, until the work was done, and Lucas had gone back to his property, and she and Gideon were at the kitchen table the way they'd been at kitchen tables together her whole life. And she said, plainly and without preamble, "Lucas asked me to build something with him. I said I would." Gideon put his fork down. He looked at his plate for a moment, then he looked at her. "You're sure?" he said. "Not a challenge, just the question a father asks when he wants to know if his daughter has thought it through." "Yes," she said. He picked his fork back up. He ate a bite of his supper. She waited. "He sets a fence post right," Gideon said finally. She looked at him. "That's your response." "I'm still working on the rest of it." He pointed his fork at her briefly. "Give me time." "You have all the time you need," she said. "Within reason." He made the sound that was almost a laugh. "Your mother used to say that exact same thing to me, in exactly that tone." He looked at his plate. "Within reason," he repeated, quieter. "She had a lot of patience with me that I didn't always deserve." "You deserved more than you gave yourself credit for," Claire said, "and less than I thought in other places." He ate another bite. "I've been thinking about Margaret, about what Elias said, that she ran toward the fire because there were children inside. He stopped. "I've been thinking about whether I would have wanted her to do anything different if I could go back." Claire waited. "No," he said quietly. "No, I wouldn't have wanted her to be different. That was who she was. I knew who she was when I married her." He looked out the window at the dark pasture. "Being angry at Elias Blackwood was easier than accepting that your mother was the kind of person who runs into fires. Because if I accept that, then there's no one to be angry at. There's just—" He stopped. "Just loss," Claire said softly. "Just loss," he agreed. "Which is the hardest thing there is. Because you can't do anything with it except carry it." They sat with that for a while. The kitchen was warm and the evening was quiet outside, and the particular piece of a shared meal after a long day settled around them, imperfect and ordinary and genuinely theirs. "Elias asked if he could come by sometime," Gideon said after a while. "Not to talk about the fire, just neighbor things. Spring boundary discussion. The creek on the east line has been doing something, apparently, that affects both properties." Claire looked at him carefully. "What did you say?" "I said I'd think about it." He met her eyes. "I'm thinking about it." "That's all anyone can ask," she said. He nodded, and they finished their supper, and she washed the dishes while he read his newspaper. And outside, the Montana night came down over the valley that had been holding this particular grief and this particular misunderstanding for 20 years. And the ground under all of it was the same ground it had always been, just more honestly understood. 3 weeks later, Elias Blackwood came to the Whitmore ranch with a bottle of good whiskey and the creek survey he'd had his man draw up. And he and Gideon sat on the porch for 2 hours and talked about the East Creek line and the spring runoff pattern and what the neighboring ranches had done about similar problems years ago. Claire brought them coffee and then left them alone. And when she looked out from the barn later, they were still sitting there, and the conversation had clearly moved beyond the creek because her father was gesturing at the mountains in the specific way he did when he was talking about something that happened before she was born, the old-timer gesture, the one that meant memory and permanence, and the particular pride of a man who has worked the same land his whole life. She went back to work in the barn and didn't try to hear what they were saying. It wasn't hers to hear. It was theirs. Annie Parrish, who was 30 years old and married to a man named Cole, and had 3 children and lived down past the Henderson place, came to the Whitmore ranch on a Saturday in late May. She came because Elias had gone to her first, had driven to her house and sat at her kitchen table and told her what he'd told Gideon, what he'd told her father years after the fact, the full account of what had happened that night when she was 4 years old. She came to Claire because she'd heard about the orchard. She stood at the gate with her oldest child on her hip and said, "I heard you're restoring the East Ridge orchard. I heard there were some new trees going in." She was a direct woman, a little uncomfortable in her own request, the way people are when they want to ask for something that has emotional weight and aren't sure it's appropriate. "My grandmother had an apple tree. It's gone now. I was wondering if, when the orchard's producing, if we might buy some of the stock." Claire looked at her, at the child on her hip who was watching everything with the total attentiveness of a 4-year-old, at the woman who had been a 4-year-old once, carried through a window by an old man who'd never told her his name until now. "You don't have to buy it," Claire said. "Come fall, when we've got something to harvest, you come and take what you can use." Annie Parrish looked at her. "That's generous." "It's not," Claire said. "It's a small thing. It's what neighbors do." Something moved in Annie's face, the complicated gratitude of someone who has just learned that the ground under a piece of their history is different from what they thought and doesn't quite know where to put that yet. "My grandmother's tree was a Honeycrisp," she said, "if you're ever looking for what to plant in the next section." "I'll keep that in mind," Claire said. The wedding was in September, when the orchard was showing the first signs of what it was becoming. Nothing harvestable yet, that would take another season, but the new growth visible and healthy, and the cleared rows standing in the light the way they'd been trying to stand for 40 years. The ceremony was brief, the way both of them wanted it, with the particular efficiency of 2 people who had spent enough time getting to the truth of things that they didn't need a long production around the moment itself. Gideon walked Claire across the short distance between the 2 assembled families. Small gatherings, close people, no more than 20 souls total, and handed her to Lucas with the expression of a man doing something that cost him something real and had decided it was worth the cost. He shook Lucas's hand before he stepped back, and the handshake lasted a beat longer than a formal handshake needs to, and then it was done. Elias Blackwood stood on the Blackwood side of the gathering and looked at his son and at the woman his son had chosen, and his face was doing the private, complicated thing that old men's faces do at weddings, the mixture of genuine happiness and everything else, the weight of the past sitting alongside the present, and not being asked to leave but not being let to dominate either. After, when the brief ceremony was complete and the food was out and the afternoon was doing its September best, cool and clear, the light at that particular slant that makes everything look like it's worth looking at, Elias walked over to Gideon. Claire watched it happen from across the clearing, watched the 2 old men come to stand near each other the way planets come near each other, pulled by something older than either of them. She didn't watch what they said. She turned back to Lucas, who was watching her watch them. "Leave them to it," he said quietly. "I know," she said. They stood together beside the spring that ran between the 2 properties, not exactly on Whitmore land, not exactly on Blackwood land, the kind of boundary feature that belongs to both sides, because water doesn't recognize lines in the ground. Someone, years ago, had let the spring's natural pool become overgrown and partially blocked, and the water had been running wrong as a result for longer than anyone had specifically noticed. Lucas had cleared it in June, quietly, between the fence work and the orchard work, without making a point of it. Now it ran properly, cold and clean, the sound of it steady underneath the sounds of the gathering. "I want to plant something here," Claire said. She'd been thinking about it since the supplier's delivery. "Not in the orchard. Here. 2 trees." Lucas looked at the ground beside the spring. He looked at it the way he looked at everything, with actual attention, with the specific consideration of a man who knew soil and growth and what things needed. "What kind?" "Something that takes a long time to grow," she said. "Something that'll be here after we're not." He was quiet for a moment. "Apple won't do well this close to the spring. Too much moisture." "I wasn't thinking apple. I was thinking oak." He looked at her. She looked back. "2 oaks," he said. "1 for each side," she said. "Not as a monument to anything, not as a ceremony, just—" She stopped, looking for the right words. "Just so there's something here that grew because people stopped letting old grief make their decisions." Lucas looked at the spring and then at the gathering behind them. Their families, imperfect and in process, doing the slow work of becoming something different than what they'd been. And then back at her. "2 oaks," he said again. "We'll put them in October when the ground's right." "October," she agreed. They put them in on an ordinary Saturday in mid-October with no ceremony and no audience, just the 2 of them and the tools and the specific hard work of planting something meant to outlast you. The ground was cold by then, resistant the way October ground always is, and it took longer than they'd planned because it always does. And by the time the second tree was properly in and staked against the winter wind, they were both tired and muddy, and the afternoon had mostly used itself up. They stood back and looked at what they'd done. 2 small trees, barely saplings, nothing impressive, the kind of thing that would be easy to miss if you didn't know what you were looking at, standing on either side of the spring in the ground between 2 ranches. "They won't look like anything for years," Lucas said. "No," she agreed. "That doesn't bother you." "I'm a patient woman." She looked at the saplings, getting more patient all the time. He put his arm around her, which he did easily now. The ease of 2 people who've been building something for long enough that the physical fact of each other has become comfortable rather than charged. She leaned into it and looked at the 2 small trees and thought about her mother, the way she'd been thinking about her mother differently since Elias had given her back the true version. Not the woman filtered through grief and anger, but the actual woman, the one who ran toward things. She thought about what it meant to be that woman's daughter, what you inherited from someone like that. Not just the shape of your face in the mirror, but the particular disposition toward difficulty, the reflex toward running at things instead of away from them, which could look like courage and sometimes was just stubbornness wearing courage's clothes. She thought it was probably both. The best things usually were. "My father came to find me this morning," Lucas said. He said it without preamble, which was how he said most things. She looked up at him. "And?" "He said he's been thinking about what to do with the letters. He wants to let the parish family have the ones that are about that night, the full account, in his own handwriting." He paused. "He said he's been keeping them too long, that they belong to the people they're about more than they belong to him." "That's right," she said. "He also said—" He stopped for a moment. "He said he wanted to do something for the Whitmore land. He didn't say it like that. He said he noticed the East Creek bend where the overflow's been wrong for years, and he thought if they rerouted the intake channel from his side of the line, it would fix the flooding problem that's been eroding your grandfather's fence posts for a decade." He glanced at her. "He phrased it as a hydrology problem." "Of course he did. He and your father talked about it last week, apparently. I didn't know until this morning." She was quiet for a moment. "They talked about it without us." "Yes." Something in Lucas's voice was careful and warm at the same time. "I think that might be progress." She thought about 2 old men sorting out creek drainage on a porch without their children managing the conversation, and she thought that was probably what progress actually looked like. Not the dramatic moments, but the ordinary ones, the Tuesday afternoons and the practical problems, the slow accumulation of times when people chose to work together instead of apart because it was simply more sensible. "There's going to be hard things still," she said, "with our fathers, between us, all of it." "I know that," Lucas said. "I'm not—" She stopped, started again. "I'm not always easy to be around. I go quiet when things are difficult, and I stay quiet too long, and I work myself into exhaustion when I'm worried about something instead of just saying I'm worried. I know that too, he said. I'm not telling you you're easy. I'm telling you you're worth it. She looked at him. That's a better answer than I expected. I've been practicing, he said. She looked back at the saplings. The evening was coming on, the light going from gold to that thin late October gray that preceded the dark by about 20 minutes and always made the valley look older than it was. The particular melancholy of seasons changing, which she'd always found more honest than sad. Things ended. Seasons turned. What you'd planted either took root or it didn't, and you couldn't always tell which for a long time. She thought about a 31-year-old woman kneeling in the mud beside a fence post in a lightning storm with her hand on a brand she recognized. About the 30 seconds it had taken to decide, and the year, almost exactly a year now, that the deciding had opened up. About all the things that had happened in that year that she hadn't known to hope for. Her father at a lunch table with a Blackwood man talking about soil, Elias delivering 20 years of overdue truth to an old neighbor, Annie Parrish standing at a gate with her child asking about apples, a fence properly set for the first time in 40 years. None of it clean, none of it resolved the way stories sometimes resolve, with everyone arriving at the right feeling at the right time. Gideon still had mornings when the old anger came back without asking, and he had to sit with it and choose something different, which he didn't always choose easily. Elias still carried the weight of the unsent letters, even the ones he'd now delivered. You didn't put down 20 years of carried guilt in a season, maybe not in a lifetime. Lucas and Claire themselves were still learning how to fight, which they did occasionally, imperfectly, with the specific friction of two people who were both used to being right and were figuring out which hills were worth standing on. But the truth was in the ground now, the way the trees were in the ground. You couldn't put it back. And something that is true and in the ground has a way of growing even when no one is tending it. Not toward any perfect shape, but toward the light, the way living things do. The last of the evening light left the valley, and the dark came in from the mountains the way it always did in October, fast and final and without apology. Lucas and Claire stood beside the spring until the cold made its point, and then they gathered their tools and walked back through the darkening toward the lights of the house. And the two young oaks stood behind them in the ground, bare and small and barely there, beginning. There is a thing that happens to people when they stop letting old grief make their decisions. It doesn't happen all at once. It doesn't announce itself. It just shows up one day in the quality of ordinary life, in the ease of a lunch eaten with someone you might have turned away, in the sound of two old men talking about creek drainage on a porch, in the look on a woman's face when she plants a tree she won't see fully grown. It isn't the absence of pain. The pain stays. Loss stays. The people who are gone stay gone, and their absence is a shape in the room that doesn't fill, and that is true for as long as it is true. But pain and life are not the same thing, and grief and hatred are not the same thing. And what Claire Whitmore had learned in a year that started with mud and a lightning storm and a brand burned into saddle leather was that the distance between those two things, between pain and hatred, between loss and blame, was exactly the distance you had to be willing to walk to get to the rest of your life. Some people walked it sooner. Some people needed 20 years and a confession on a porch, and a son who wouldn't stop asking questions until the truth came out. The valley didn't judge which one you were. It just kept going, season into season, the way it always had, older than any of the grief it had been asked to hold, larger than any of the stories that had been told across it, indifferent and patient and available, if you were willing to work it honestly, for whatever you had the courage to grow.